Good morning. Good morning. God bless you. Well, day after election day. Now I'm recording this. I don't know the outcome, so hopefully things work out in God's favor. So I'll pray in that direction. Right now I'm recording this on election day. And dear Heavenly Father, I just praise you and I thank you so much for the opportunities we're allowed to have in this country, that we can go and vote for our leaders. And we give you praise and thanks that you speak to everyone's heart, that they can look for the people that are supportive of what you tell us we should care about, and we look to you for guidance and our leaders. We give you all the praise and thanks in Jesus' precious name. I pray, amen. So we are in Exodus, continuing with chapter 21, taking the next slice out of it. And I call this one the laws regarding servitude. So finishing up servitude and talking about this time. We talked about the male servants yesterday. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the female servants today. And then about some rules about violence we'll be getting into. And violence will start today and actually continue for most of the rest of the we'll touch base on this idea of we're talking about a time frame where we really didn't have a lot of law and order set up in government. Law and order was pretty much non-existent when it came to, there was no police. There were armies, particularly in some of the government agencies that did as you perform justice. But right now, in this particular time frame, we got the entire nation of Israel out in the middle of the desert. And they're getting their guidance from God directly through Moses. And they don't have necessarily any kind of a law and order. There's no constitution yet or anything along that lines. That's where a lot of this moral law comes in. So that some of this is kind of self-explanatory, but God wanted to make sure that they had a guideline to go by. And not only for the idea of judgment, but also for us to understand what God suggests in the way of us conducting our lives. So I think it's an important thing to see what God sees as being right and wrong. And that gives us a good place to start with for ourselves, even though we can't meet all the requirements of the law perfectly. And God knows that, and that's why. But he gives us a rule stick to measure ourselves against. So keep with that same picture. So pretty much you got Moses up there in front of all the people, and he is explaining all these different laws to the people. Now, the fact that he's got some blood there in a bowl, that's going to be later on. This particular picture covers pretty much from chapters 20 through 24. So we're going to get into the whole idea of the sacrifice later on. So I'm sure that's what he's doing there. It has to do with the sacrifice. But right now, he's just giving the different judgments to the people. So let's get some verses over here. And we left off yesterday, and we're just getting ready to get into the rights of the female servants. And this includes daughters. And I started to say about daughters. Many of the lords, particularly the higher lords, and you'll even see it a little bit even in places like Saudi Arabia today, even the Arabian countries, that daughters were actually considered an asset to a king or a leader, because he could use it as use them in the way of writing agreements with other countries. And I know it doesn't sound very, but it's basically the arranged marriage kind of atmosphere. It's still used to this day in some countries. India, I believe, still does arranged marriages, where a father will talk to the father of a young man, and they'll come up with an arrangement to give their daughter to the son of another world leader. And this sets up a nice environment for the two leaders to be able to conduct business. And I'm sure that I know there's probably ladies listening going, "Oh, I would never go for that," but that's the way it was back then. And You could actually be, you heard the old saying that you could marry a prince. Well, that's what typically we're talking about here. Good example is Solomon. Solomon was well desired by many ladies of the old world. That's why he had so many wives. He had over 1,000 wives, I think it was, like 600 wives and like 400 concubines, which he wasn't supposed to do. But every world leader wanted his favor, and every time they would come, they would offer him another bride. I don't really know how many he really actually considered wives that actually bore children for him, but it doesn't really. The Bible doesn't go into detail on that part, because God still believes in one man, one woman for one life. I like that saying: one man for one woman for one life. But in this time frame, we're going to see that's not necessarily so. So let's get off here in verse 7. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as a manservants do. Now, I know this sounds bad, sell her. This is a strange verse. Nehemiah 5:5 kind of helps a little bit in this area. Yet now our flesh is as flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought unto bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. So this is the idea of the betrothal. When a man would sell, they called it selling, but it's more like a betrothal, where the woman was given in return for favors to some other person, and she would be obligated to that family. And it could be at a very young age where the girl would actually grow up with that family and get used to them. And then at some point, the father of that family would have her marry one of her sons. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about here a little bit. So this is a strange verse in our culture. But here are some commentaries on the selling of a daughter. It's not the same as being a slave, but more of a betrothal, but done at an early age to allow the girl to get used to the family. A theologian by the name of Kaiser says, refers to a girl who is sold by her father, not for slavery, but for marriage. Then another theologian, Cole, probably the origin of the custom was the same in either case, to avoid paying a higher bride price at a later age. In other words, they would do it early, so they would pay less if the girl was sold prior to marriage age, because once they reach marriage age, then the price is more expensive. At a later age, and to rear the future daughter-in-law within the family, ensuring that she fitted in. Such an attitude to slaves abolished slavery, except in name. I know it sounds very much like slavery, and it really does. So I'm sure the girl had no options in choosing what family she was going to live with. Okay, on to verse 8. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. So in this case, if the man who had bought her does not fulfill the requirement of actually either marrying her himself or giving it, and we're going to see here in a minute, then he was still under the obligation to take care of her. So who hath dealt deceivably? Deuteronomy helps us with this a little bit. Over in Deuteronomy 20, verse 7. And what man is there that hath betrothed a wife and hath not taken her? Let him go and return unto his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man take her. And jump into chapter 21, verse 11 through 14. And seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, and that thou wouldest have her to thy wife. Then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and she shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. So it was get used to the idea she's not going home. And after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whether she will, but thou shalt not sell her at all for money. So in this case, if you took her as a wife, you could not then go ahead and sell her like a slave. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. Whenever you see the word humbled, it usually means that they had intercourse and that she's no longer a virgin. A woman who was not a virgin anymore was of less value to possibly remarry once defiled. As we read through the Old Testament, the dealings God did not intend with the treatment of women. Jesus did a lot for women as we get to the New Testament. When you see examples of the women at the well or one caught in adultery, you can see the compassion of how he treated them with a greater love, even though they had sinned. I can see men of that period culturally did not treat them as God had intended. Since Jesus is the one giving the law, but like many of us who give into the flesh, we are no different. And one man, one woman for one life is my advice to any young couple looking at marriage. And stay a virgin until marriage. You will be much more blessed than if you were not. And I see this as a really important thing that I've realized in my life, that boy, if we could just get back to the basics of courtship and trying to stay pure until marriage, I think that there would be a lot more successful marriages. And they both come from the same background too, particularly if if you're a Christian, then you should be looking for a Christian woman, and you'll do much better if you both believe the same way. Okay, back to Exodus, verses 9 through 11. And if he had betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. So once he took her upon himself, even if there was money exchanged, she becomes like a daughter to him, not necessarily like a slave. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall not be diminished. So say he decides that he doesn't want her as a wife, but she still lives in the house there with them, and he goes on to marry someone else, she should get all the same things that she deserves according to if she was married to him. Verse 11, and if he do not these things thee unto her, then she shall go out free without money. In other words, she won't be sold to anyone else and should be allowed to leave. So betrothal her unto, and we got some other examples of this in Exodus 22:17. If her father utterly refuses to give her unto him, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. So he's still responsible, the fathers of the young ladies, to give a dowry. Then Genesis 38:11. Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah my son be grown. But he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. This is a very interesting story. Tamar ended up not ever. Her husband had died, and under the rule of the Levirate marriage, the brother of her deceased husband was required to come under her and give her and marry her, and give her a child, so that the name would continue of his brother. And that was a requirement. We're going to see if we get to Deuteronomy. But that's another rule that Moses implemented that to ensure that the tribes of Israel continued. But Tamar ends up doing something very trickily because in this case it was Judah did not follow through to what he said he was going to do. We went through that when we were in Genesis, if you remember. Okay, Leviticus 22:13 also. But if the priest's daughter be a widow or divorced and have no child and is returned unto her father's house, as in her youth, she shall eat of her father's meat, but there shall no stranger eat thereof. So if some reason she becomes homeless without a husband, then she can return home under these same rules. In other words, she is now not a slave and should receive the same food and like items as your own daughter would. Very much like adoption almost. when it mentions there her food, she's just talking about her flesh. He should not only afford her a sufficient quality of food as before, but of the same quality. She is not to be fed like a common slave, with a sufficiency of bread and vegetables, milk, etc., but with her customary supply of flesh and other agreeable articles of food. As long as her diet could not change either, she couldn't resort back to what they feed the slaves. She should continue to receive the same food that she would get it sitting at the table as a daughter. 1 Corinthians 7, 1-6 talks about this. Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath no power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath no power over his own body, but the wife. Defraud not ye, this is the part I'm mainly getting to, defraud ye not one to the other, except to be consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again. The saying, tempt you not for your inconsistency. But I speak to this by permission and not by commandment. So I brought that in because I wanted to realize that this is what God intended, is that one man and one woman. This idea of a lot of this stuff that happened during this particular culture was mainly because of the realization that they were heading into a land where this was very common. So that God is setting up all these rules to make sure that they don't actually intermarry with those people that they're going to be taking over here shortly. But I kind of think of it that way. Back to Exodus 21:12. Now we're going to get into the violence part of this message. That pretty much talks about the ladies, at least in this part. So basically overall, again, the ladies, it was a duty of the family to make sure the ladies were actually taken care of, and there's multiple ways that was done, by selling her to a potential marriage to a young man. It might be done quite early, very young age, particularly if it was in a foreign country where the young woman maybe would have to travel and would go to live with the other family and grow up with that family before the period of time where they but there are still women slaves too. We already talked about that when I talked about the men slaves coming in with a married woman. That was kind of different. But you can see too that if a slave came in, that the slave owner, the master, may also give one of his daughters to a slave to marry, and then the rules change because the master is still in control of the daughter. These get very, very complicated. And a lot of this was really to keep the purity of the tribes. Because remember, the overall outcome, too, was to make sure that the seed going all the way back to Adam made it all the way to Jesus Christ. So that because Judea was picked as the tribe, that they needed to ensure that seed stayed pure all the way through and didn't intermarry with too many other cultures. I hope that makes sense to everybody. And it gets kind of complicated, some of these Old Testament areas, but I'm trying my best. I hope it makes sense. So now we're going to move into rules about violence and how to handle judgment about violence. So verse 12, he that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. It's basically an eye for an eye. This is where it gets into that whole idea of the kinsman redeemer. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. This is also more about being on the offense. In other words, you smite a man out of vengeance or out of hatred or anger rather than defense. Jesus speaks to this in Matthew 26:52. And Jesus said, put up again thy sword under his place, for all that they that take the sword shall perish by the sword. Now, in another verse I'm going to show you, Jesus also says that we should be able to defend ourselves. So what we're talking about here is it's being offensive. In other words, actually going to kill somebody for no apparent reason, just for maybe a dispute over land, or there's no legitimate reason to kill them. So that's what this verse, I believe, is talking to. Now, here it's not about using a weapon, but here Jesus is saying not to use it as an offense. But Jesus had told the disciples to have a weapon for defense just prior to this verse in Matthew. It's written in Luke 22:36. That's the famous passage where Jesus actually tells them to sell a garment in order to buy a sword. Let's read it. Then said he, this is Jesus speaking, unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip, and he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. So self-defense is allowed under Jesus. And so this particular verse is not talking about necessarily self-defense, or even when you're in a war kind of a scenario. There's other verses that deal with that kind of stuff. But this is where you intentionally go out and actually try to hurt somebody instead of taking it to the authorities. In this case, no one had tried to hurt anyone. Plus, Jesus had to die on the cross for us. So Jesus is not saying no, not to defend oneself in this verse. Verse 13. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. Now let's get into those cities of refuge that we talked about. If you were with me when we were talking about the story of Ruth, that story is very much about what they call the kinsman redeemer, and also these cities of refuge. So let's say that by accident you kill somebody. Let's say you're building a wall, and a rock falls on somebody that's working for you, and they die. Okay, it's an accident. It's just pure accident. You had no ill intent in your. Well, at that point, the kinsman of that person that died has the right to kill you. The basic, but because it was an accident and because there was no intentional trying to kill them, what you would do at that point is you would flee to a city of refuge, and basically it was almost like the courtroom in a scenario. So again, like I said, we don't have any police. There was no courts yet per se, but the city fathers of a city of refuge would meet at the gate. That's where that whole gate thing came in. So you would go to one of those particular cities, and you would tell the story to the fathers of that city, and they would decide if they agreed that it was an accident and not intentional. And you would stay there in the city of refuge, and then the kinsman redeemer could not come and kill you there. And there's rules about how the kinsman redeemer could not go in what they call lie in wait, and we're going to get into that too. So some examples of this over Numbers, talking about city of refuge, Numbers 35 verse 6. And among the cities which you shall give unto the Levites, there shall be 6 cities for refuge, where you shall appoint for the manslayer, that he may flee thither, and to them ye shall add 42 cities. Once they go into the promised land, they're going to add a whole bunch of cities to that. Because you need to be able to get to it rather quickly. And Deuteronomy talks about this too, in Deuteronomy 19, verse 2 through 9. Thou shalt separate these cities from thee in the midst of the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. Thou shalt prepare thee a way and divide the coast of the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee to inherit, into 3 parts, that every slayer may flee thither. And this is the case of the slayer which shall flee thither, that he may live. Whosoever killeth his neighbor ignorantly, that means by accident, whom he hated not in time past. In other words, they didn't have a disagreement before. And when a man goeth into the wood with his neighbor to hew wood, and his hand fetches a stroke with the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slipped off from the helve, and lighten upon his neighbor that he die, he shall flee unto one of these cities and live. There's an example right in Scripture that explains the idea of an accident. Lest the avenger of the blood pursue the slayer while his heart is hot, and overtake him, because the way is long, and slay him, where he was not worthy of death, insomuch as he hated him not in time past. So he never had a problem with him before. Wherefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt separate these cities from thee. I would spread them out, make sure that they're accessible to the people. If the Lord thy God enlarge the coast as he hath sworn unto thy fathers, and give thee all the land which he promised to give unto thy fathers, thou shalt keep all these commandments to do them, which I command thee this day, to love the Lord thy God, and to walk ever in his ways, thou shalt add 3 cities more for thee besides these 3. So he's basically saying here in Deuteronomy to expand, if need be, for the amount of land that you need to cover. So he basically convinced the city fathers it was an accident. This gets into this idea of the kinsman redeemer, which is a great example of what Jesus has done for us. We have sinned unto death and are deserving of death. But our city of refuge is Jesus Christ as our high priest, who also died for us. And we are now free from sin because of what he did for us. The book of Ruth is a great story about this role of the kinsman redeemer. If you want a great example, but basically, you can almost see a pattern here that God is setting up to show this idea of the kinsman redeemer and the avenger of blood. The avenger of blood basically is us. In our sinful state, we deserve to die, so that we run to the Lord in order to be relieved. The rule, as we get into more of the kinsman redeemer, you stay in that city of refuge until the high priest dies. And once the high priest dies, then you're free to go anywhere you want. And that the avenger of blood can't touch you. Well, our high priest, which is Jesus Christ, did die on the cross for our sins. So that we all have that same idea. We're free from the sin of death from that because of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ. I hope that parallel kind of makes sense. So back to Exodus 21:14. That's the kinsman redeemer in a nutshell. As we go through some of these other things, we may see other examples of the same thing. Verse 14 of chapter 21. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. In this case, the man is actually goes and tries to see. You almost have to wait. If you happen to see the avenger or the kinsman, the person who killed your kinsman, you can't go looking for him. In other words, you can't lie in wait. In other words, let's say he ran to a sanctuary city. You can't sit outside the city and hope that maybe he accidentally comes out and you kill him. That's called lying in wait. And so you can't do that, or you'll be breaking the rule of the kinsman redeemer. It has to be done accidentally. In other words, you got to kind of run into him accidentally. And a great example of this is over in 1 Kings 2:29 through 34. And it was told King Solomon that Joab was fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord, and behold, he was by the altar. And Solomon sent Benani, the son of Jehoiada, saying, Go, fall upon him. Fall upon him means to kill him. And Benani came to the tabernacle of the Lord and said unto him, Thus saith the king, Come forth. And he said, Nay, but I will die here. And Benani brought the king word again, saying, Thus saith Joab, and thus he answered me. And the king said unto him, Do as he has said, and fall upon him, and bury him, that thou mayest take away the innocent blood which Joab shed from me, and from the house of my father. And the Lord shall return his blood upon his head, who fell upon 2 men more righteous and better than he. So as he killed 2 men, and slew them with the sword, my father David not knowing thereof, to wit, Abner the son of Ner, captain of the host of Israel, and Amasa the son of Jether, captain of the host of Judea. Their blood shall therefore return upon the head of Joab, and upon the head of his seed forever, but upon David and upon his seed and upon his house, and upon his throne shall there be peace forever from the Lord. So Benani the son of Jehoiada went up and fell upon him and slew him, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. This was a case where he actually went and killed 2 people intentionally with guile. So he couldn't use the he basically ran to the temple for protection, and Solomon kicked in and said, no, you can't go to a city of refuge to get refuge when you did it intentionally, and he ended up getting slewed. So that's what's being based on there. Okay, verse 15 of chapter 21. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. There's no conditions on this one. And also, I'm going to jump over verse 16 for a second. Go to verse 17. And he that curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. God is very, when it comes to parents, God is pretty strict. Here's a story of one such case. It was in Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that when they have chastised him, will not hearken unto them, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him and bring him out unto the elders of the city, unto the gate of his place. This is where the elders met, at the gate. I've mentioned that many times before. That was kind of like the courtroom, like city hall almost. And this is where the city fathers would make decisions about stuff. Verse 20, and they shall say unto the elders of the city, this is our son, he is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. And all the men of the city shall stone him with stones that he die, so that shalt thou put evil away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So basically they made an example of him. But they had to prove their case before the city fathers before it would be instituted. But you can see that they took it very, very seriously when somebody didn't obey their parents. To smite either father or mother in a manner which indicated either contempt or malice, or left marks of violence, was deemed a proof of so ungrateful and unnatural disposition. So if they had evidence that the parents were actually, that the son had done things improper to the parents, that no provocation was admitted as an excuse, but the offense was made capital. This is I'm reading an excerpt from Reverend T. Scott. He's another theologian. Nay, who cursed his father and mother, who utterly imprecations, ill wishes, or revilings against the parent, was included in the same sense. Though few crimes were made capital by the law of Moses, the law of God as delegated to parents is honored when they are honored, and despised when they are despised. And to rebel against the lawful exercise of this authority is rebellion against God. So that, when you disrespect your parents, that's in direct violation of God. You're basically disrespecting God. And I think that, some would say, well, what if you got parents who beat you for no apparent reason, and there's violence in the house and things of that nature, drug addicts and so on and so forth. Well, that basically that God would take care of them in such a way that would be, I know that those types of things, again, self-defense is always allowed. So if they're beating you for no apparent reason, that's one thing. But to actually dishonor them when they're trying to do what's best for you, then that's God takes that seriously. Okay, on to verse 16. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Now, for this one, I took out of order as it reminded me of what Joseph went through. Based on this law, his brothers were guilty of this. But Joseph knew better that it worked out for good. And Joseph, as far as the Bible says, was not angry with them at all. Remember that Joseph was taken by their brothers and sold into slavery. That's over in Genesis 50, 15 through 21, if you want to read through it. I'm already over time, so I'm going to skip that passage. Okay, back to Exodus 21:18. And if a man strive together and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed. Now, this is talking about if a man gets hurt by another out of vengeance, but he doesn't die, then it's the man who struck him's responsibility to make sure that he's taken care of until he gets well again. And that's what we got to see here in this portion. Verse 19, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quick. In other words, he's responsible. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. So he's got to basically pay his wages and also pay for any medical care, which only seems right. This one actually seems very right to me. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. So you didn't have overall rights to actually treat a servant improperly, even if they were a slave. Verse 21. Notwithstanding, if you continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is in his money. So, for instance, that there might be times that you might punish a servant in such a way that doesn't hurt them, as long as they can continue to do their work, then the master won't be punished. Well, the servant is different, but still God expects that we should be honoring to our servants also. Being punished, or in other words, avenged. Numbers 35, 19 through 28 talk to this. The revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meeteth him, he shall slay him. But if he thrust him of hatred or hurl at him by laying of wait, that he die. This is what I was talking about earlier. Or in enmity smite him with his hand, that he die. He that smote him shall surely be put to death, for he is a murderer. The revenger of blood shall slay the murderer when he meeteth him. But if he thrust him suddenly without enmity, or have cast upon him anything without lying in wait, in other words, he just happens to meet him on the street, or with any stone wherewith a man may die, seeing him not, and cast it upon him that he die, and was not his enemy, neither sought his harm. Then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood according to these judgments. This is the idea of the city fathers deciding if they could keep him in a city of refuge. And the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whether he was fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with holy oil. It had to be a high priest that was anointed, it was put in that position. But if the slayer shall at any time come without the border of the city of refuge, whether he was fled, and the revenger of blood find him without the borders of the city of his refuge, and the revenger of blood kill the slayer, he shall not be guilty of the blood. So if the person left the city of refuge, then the revenger of blood could kill him, because he should have remained in the city of his refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer shall return into the land of his possessions. So he's allowed to go free. Romans 13:4 mentions this too. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So it really has to do with whether or not it was an innocent misunderstanding, or if it was done with evil intent. I hope that all makes sense. So I know there's a lot there to take in, but basically, again, setting up the rules for an organized society. And I think a lot of these rules actually make sense to us, except for maybe some of the slave rules. I still think slavery is wrong, but as I was talking about yesterday too, that slavery was actually quite common for paying off of debts. They used to call it, you go back even before the Social Security Act and some of the other things, in order to make it easier for people to survive if they're out of work, or if they're sick or injured, like welfare and Social Security. You go back to like the 1800s. They used to have a thing called the poorhouse. And the poorhouse was basically someplace you went where if you didn't have any money, you would go there and basically work for your living, and you're somewhat of a slave to the house. So similar idea. Of course, I'm not condoning any kind of slavery like what happened, way back in our history in America. Of course, that was wrong, because we would actually intentionally go to another country and take people for no apparent reason. Another common use of slavery, though, is when one country took over another country. The people of the country that was captured became slaves to the other country. That was very, very common also. So it's a long history. But here God is trying to set up rules about those kind of things, because it's going to happen to the Jewish nation as they go forward, as we already know when you get into things like judges and kings and the different wars going on. There's going to be a lot of this going on. So God here is basically telling them the rules they need to follow when it comes to this kind of stuff. Okay, so that's it for today. Let's end with a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord. Thank you so much for helping us to understand some of this stuff that we know is coming in the future, and it gives us a background also in how that we are dead to our sin, and that through Jesus Christ, our kinsman redeemer, we give you praise and thanks for this opportunity to for us to be able to pay our debt, and that we can go to a city of refuge that you provided for us. We give you praise and thanks. In Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen. Okay, you guys have a great day, and we will talk again tomorrow.